So the scientific method is a great tool for determining truth. And this is because the scientific method forces us to attempt and align our ideas to reality and determine which of our ideas we can find support for as compared with those we might just think or assume are true without proper justification. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the scientific method, in general terms, we begin by forming a hypothesis about the world, which would be something like, I think X, whatever X is, happens to be true. Then we will derive predictions from this hypothesis. So if X is true, we should see evidence of Y. And then we go out and we test these predictions as carefully as possible by gathering data in controlled ways to see if reality agrees with us. While the scientific method is very simple in its form, it's also responsible for generating a great deal of knowledge about the world. However, like any tool, its value can be heavily determined by who is utilizing it and how they do so. That is, the world's best guitar might produce some of the cleanest tones and sounds that you've ever heard, and you could give that guitar all the supporting accessories available, but it's not going to produce hit song after hit song if you just hand it to an amateur who knows little about playing guitar or writing music. Similarly, you can use a knife in the kitchen to prepare food, but you're not necessarily going to prepare gourmet food because you have a good knife. You could also, hypothetically, use a knife to murder somebody. So to get the tools to help you complete goals, knowledge of how to use the tools most effectively is vital. And the same tool can be put towards much different end goals. And the same can be said of the scientific method. While the method in general is very useful for discovering important truths about the world, it can also be employed in ways that are unlikely to yield any important results, such as people exploring nonsensical or pointless hypotheses and predictions, and can also be employed in ways that actively mislead people into thinking they have discovered something that's true when it's actually false, such as when they have a poorly designed experiment and they interpret this to have produced firm evidence in favor of what is ultimately an incorrect conclusion. So to understand that tools are only as valuable as the way we use them, this understanding has really highlighted to me the importance of using evolutionary theory for guiding psychological research. That is, evolutionary theory and an understanding of biological function helps guide your search for plausible scientific hypotheses and real, non-circular explanations for why our psychology has the form that it does. In essence, evolutionary theory helps you use the scientific method efficiently to accurately explain the world around us. And we saw an example of this in our early lectures when we were discussing an apple peeler, which you can see here. If you were doing research on this device without knowing its function, indeed without even knowing that it may have a function, your understanding of the device is going to proceed remarkably slowly, if at all. By contrast, the moment you know that this device has been designed to peel and core apples, you can immediately understand with much more clarity what component parts it should be expected to have, why you should expect it to have those parts, what type of inputs the device should expect, and what types of outputs it should produce. So knowing that this is a device designed to peel and core apples can lead one to predict the presence of a mount with which to hold the apple, a crank capable of rotating the apple while moving it forward through different blades that are capable of peeling off the skin without removing too much of the fruit, and also removing the core of the apple, which contains seeds, again, without removing too much of the excess fruit. And it can also lead you to predict that you probably shouldn't try to put an egg in here, you probably shouldn't try to put rocks in here or paper. You might not predict that it's going to have a heating element. And you also might understand that, well, maybe you could use this to peel an onion or an apple. It's also going to unnecessarily remove the centers because potatoes and onions don't have seeds in the middle that have to be cored. Without a functional theory to guide your understanding and research into the device that you're looking at, you would be very hard-pressed to independently predict any of that. You may spend time doing research on pointless avenues, such as searching the device for a heating element that it doesn't have. Or you might fail to predict the presence of some vital design features. That is, just looking at this, it's not immediately clear that this device has one blade, let alone two. On top of not knowing what to look for, psychological research that lacks evolutionary theory often doesn't know how to explain results properly. As a result, much of the research that people do in psychology will end up being a restatement phrased as an explanation for a finding, or they may fail to provide complete explanations for their findings in general. And I want to look at two examples of non-evolutionary explanations for some features of our psychology. This type of stuff you're going to see in any introductory psychology textbook and in much of the writing in the academic field. So the first example I want to highlight comes from the book The Hidden Agenda of the Political Mind by Robert Kurzban and Jason Whedon. It's a great book, good read. And they say this: suppose that you have an interesting finding about human beings. That is, some people enjoy going out to parties, drinking, dancing, meeting new people, and the like, anything associated with that. Other people tend to avoid such settings. They find loud parties with lots of strangers to be overwhelming or unpleasant. So how do you want to explain the difference between these two groups of people? Now imagine the go-to explanation for many, and this is normal people and psychology researchers alike, would be to reference some personality difference between the partygoers and the non-partygoers. That is, those who like parties tend to be more extroverted, while those who do not like parties tend to be more introverted. So the explanation here for why people like parties then is that they have an extroverted personality, while the explanation for why people don't like parties is that they have more of an introverted personality. Now that's all well and good until one starts to consider, how do we know whether somebody is an introvert or an extrovert? And as Kurzban and Whedon point out, you understand this by giving people personality tests. And the questions on those personality tests that are going to determine who we classify as introverted or extroverted tend to include some questions like, do you enjoy going out to parties? Do you enjoy meeting lots of new people? And so on. So the fact that people enjoy parties is explained by noting that they are extroverts. And we know they're extroverts because they tell us that they like parties. And it doesn't take a lot of thinking about that to figure out that this explanation isn't really an explanation at all. All we're doing here is just restating our finding with a new label, and it's entirely circular. We actually haven't explained anything. We just say the people who are extroverted like going to parties, and we know they like that because they're extroverted, and we know they're extroverted because they like to go to parties, and the whole thing is very circular. The second example of poor explanations comes from a book called Self Theories by author Carol Dweck. And in this book, she's discussing what she calls incremental and entity theories. Since those terms are going to be a bit clunky for novice readers, I'm going to use the simpler terms of growth mindset and fixed mindset instead, but the general idea here is pretty much the same. The difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset can be described briefly through the following example. Let's say you took a math test and you got a failing grade. Did you fail because you didn't put in enough effort, or did you fail because you're not smart enough? If you think you failed because you didn't put in enough effort, you would be considered as having a growth mindset, because you think you can do better in the future if you change your behavior. Maybe that means you're going to study for longer next time. Maybe that means you're going to change your approach to studying. That's the growth mindset. By contrast, if you think you failed because you're just not smart enough, you'd be considered to have a fixed mindset. You think you're simply unable to accomplish this task because you have some fixed level of intelligence that you can't change, and that level of intelligence is lower than what you need to successfully complete the task, so you really shouldn't bother trying the task again because it's going to amount to nothing. It's impossible. The entire book was effectively cataloging research finding after research finding that people that have this growth mindset tend to have better long-term outcomes in life than those with a fixed mindsets, especially in the face of adversity. That is, in essence, both people that have fixed or growth mindsets might do well at a task if they have the necessary knowledge to succeed at it. So if you give both of these people an easy task, they'll both succeed and everything is going to look pretty much the same as far as outcomes are concerned. But if they fail at this task, the people with the growth mindset tend to improve at it over time, while people with the fixed mindsets really don't improve as much in that regard, if they improve at all. And over time, the people with growth mindsets tend to exceed the performance of people with the fixed mindsets who tend to fall behind. Now, intuitively, this is going to sound very plausible to a lot of people. After all, if you don't think you can get better at something, you're probably not going to try to get better at it. Because why would you do something you think is impossible? So if you think the task is impossible, then you put in less effort, you practice less, you study less, and over time it shouldn't be a surprise that you tend to get worse outcomes in terms of achievement relative to people that are putting in more effort, more practice, and more study. Provided improvement at the task is possible, people who try to improve tend to improve, whereas those who don't tend to try and improve fail to improve. And this, again, is pretty straightforward, I'm sure. But as I was reading the book, a question occurred to me often and throughout my reading, which was, if growth mindset is such a useful thing to have in terms of achieving a positive outcome, well, then why doesn't everyone just have a growth mindset all the time about pretty much everything? If I was phrasing this in the functional language of evolutionary psychology, if growth mindset tends to help us achieve our long-term adaptive goals, why would anybody hold a fixed mindset? What is the function of this fixed mindset thinking that allows it to persist in the population without it being outcompeted by the growth mindset people? And to add some additional context to my question here, think about vision, the ability to see. Vision appears to be adaptive for several reasons. It is adaptive to be able to see. So pretty much every single member of the human species, and members of pretty much many other species, universally develop eyes and the ability to see, barring some mutations or environmental insults that might blind people. Pretty much every human being is born with eyes and the ability to see. If you were looking at a population that had a substantial number of people who were born without eyes, or were blind, they had eyes and the eyes didn't work, this would pose a very real adaptive mystery to solve. And I thought of that question of function frequently throughout my reading of the book because the author never stopped to try and explain what the function is of this fixed mindset until this one very small passage at the end of the book, which we can see here. And Dweck writes this: I have been stressing the vulnerability created by holding an entity theory, and that means a fixed mindset. But we must ask, why do so many people hold entity theories? Several things come to mind. An entity theory may give people a sense of security in a complex world. For some personality theories, what people seek more than almost anything else is the sense that they can predict things, that they can anticipate future events. An entity theory certainly provides people with a sense that their social world is highly predictable. It can be comforting to believe that you can know people, including yourself, easily and then know what to expect from them. It could also be that so many people hold the entity view because it is easy to transmit and learn. We saw how merely praising intelligence could transmit the view that intelligence is a fixed trait. Thus, an entity theory can be a simple but comfortable belief, but those benefits, as we have seen, come with some costs. With all respect to Dweck's work throughout the book, this passage is complete nonsense. If you've been following along with our evolutionary psychology lessons to this point, and you've been a careful consumer of that information, many glaring problems should jump out at you immediately from what she just said, and we can just consider a few here. First, this passage should not appear as a throwaway section at the very end of her book. It should be a principle that helps guide and understand research throughout the entire work. It should be guiding the search for adaptations and biological design features that would have been unknown without knowledge of the mechanism's function. It should contextualize all the research that we are presented. Adding this idea at the very end of the book in such a paltry fashion is just like trying to study the apple peeler without any guess as to what its function might be. What you end up with is a mere cataloging of research findings rather than any conceptual understanding of them and how they fit into a broader framework. Second, the idea that a fixed mindset has a benefit of making people feel good via a sense of security in a complex world, this doesn't actually explain anything. It just kicks the can back a level in terms of what you actually have to explain. For instance, why is feeling good itself adaptive? It's kind of like telling someone that rather than worrying about infidelity in their relationship, they should just pretend it's not happening because that will make them feel secure in their relationship and thus they will feel happier. We can immediately see why this explanation of because it feels good isn't really an explanation at all. Being happy and feeling good itself doesn't accomplish anything. Behaviors accomplish things, not feelings. Feelings might motivate behaviors, but if they don't motivate behaviors, evolutionary forces cannot select for them. So the question we have to ask is, what are the behaviors these fixed mindsets are encouraging, and why do they help? And in this sense, we get nothing from this explanation. But even if for a moment we granted the idea that feeling good itself is somehow adaptive, and for some reason that feeling good can only be achieved via a sense of security, why don't people just feel secure all the time regardless of what's going on? After all, Dweck heavily implies in this passage that holding a fixed mindset is maladaptive. That is, people are wrong to hold it and it causes them long-term harm. If people can feel good about things that are wrong and cause them harm, why are we jumping through all these weird cognitive hoops? First trying to believe something that's false, and then only feeling secure because of that false belief. Why not just feel secure without that lie? Or why not just feel happy regardless of whether you are secure? Why not feel happy and comfortable with a world that's just less predictable? These questions are never addressed. Third, judging from the look of what she wrote, she didn't even bother to test her hypothesis. That is, are people who hold fixed mindsets happier? Do they feel better? This is a testable hypothesis that she could have derived from her predictions, but judging by the fact that she didn't cite anything towards that end as far as I can tell, it didn't seem like she tested to see if it was even true. Moreover, why don't people who hold growth mindsets seem to experience the same need for security and predictability about the world as the people who hold fixed mindsets do? If feeling good is so important and holding a fixed mindset makes you feel better, then why are people holding the growth mindsets? Well, maybe Dweck might respond, because holding growth mindsets actually makes people achieve things, and then they can feel good about those achievements. And fair enough, but then shouldn't everyone hold a growth mindset and improve at what they do and feel better about improving, instead of feeling better about some lie that holds them back in life? This hypothetical response would leave us right back at square one. Fourth, Dweck notes that a fixed mindset can apparently be transmitted just by praising someone's intelligence. Now, if you remember our lectures about learning, you're going to recall that the mind does not learn at random. It learns some things far better than others. Humans can learn language, for instance, without any explicit instructions. Other species don't do this. By contrast, rats can struggle to learn that water moves around the world, but they can learn that fact readily about food. And more importantly, once you read through the full implication here, Dweck is really suggesting that the human mind doesn't really learn a fixed mindset from intelligence being praised, because praising intelligence doesn't tell you about a fixed mindset. Rather, what's happening here is that the mind is actively creating a fixed mindset from intelligence being praised. And that's a very, very key difference. By her own summary, a fixed mindset isn't being transmitted. It's being generated by the mind itself. And this requires another explanation. If people are generating a fixed mindset in the presence of having their intelligence praised, why is the mind actively creating what is a false belief that is going to harm long-term progress spontaneously? Things that are maladaptive to people should not be predicted to be easy to learn. Her explanation, in sum, is little better than having her just written, "Oh, this sure is weird, right?" and then moved on. We would have gained about as much real insight and explanation from that than her actual explanation at the end of the book. And that's what an explanation tends to look like in psychology more generally, a large amount of the time. Without an evolutionary framework, by my estimation, by my reading of the literature, psychology academics literally do not know what a proper explanation looks like. And you can think about it this way. In psychology without evolutionary theory, you have no evolutionary theory here. What is an explanation's endpoint? When do you know that you have fully explained the thing you are studying? Well, in theory, no such endpoint actually exists. There's no agreed upon meaning of what a complete explanation is. Now, in practice, like the passage we just reviewed, explanations in psychology tend to be reached when people land on the "it feels good" square, not knowing or appreciating that feeling good requires an explanation itself. Alternatively, as we saw in the introversion-extroversion explanation for why people do or don't enjoy parties, another form of explanation that psychology researchers give is to just give their finding a label, and that label becomes a circular explanation for the behavior. Again, we get nowhere. You can contrast this with the evolutionary framework, where you hit a possible explanation when you have traced a mechanism back to its impact on reproductive fitness. Once you can explain how something reproduces itself successfully, you no longer need to explain it any further, because you don't need to explain why things that reproduce themselves tend to exist. This adaptive explanation breaks both the circularity of just renaming things and explains the existence of mechanisms in a way that doesn't require further explanation. This is what a full, complete explanation looks like. And if you put these two frameworks next to each other, it's easy to see which one is going to make more progress in understanding not just human behavior, but also the behavior of non-human species, tying all of life together into a conceptual framework that informs our understanding of all of life entirely. Kin selection is an explanation, for instance, for behaviors that apply to humans, just as it applies to birds, to fish, to insects, and bacteria. Well, what about a non-evolutionarily informed concept like self-esteem? How do you feel about yourself? How does this explain your behavior? How often do you hear that concept of self-esteem applied to any species that's not a human? The psychology researchers talk a lot about how insects and pigs and roosters and seahorses require a sense of predictability about their world to feel good, and so will believe something incorrect about the world to achieve that sense of mental security. How about this? Have you ever heard a psychology researcher explain that birds sing and crickets chirp because it fulfills some fundamental creative need in that species that improves their self-esteem and makes them feel good? Of course not. You don't hear that, and it makes no sense to think about the world that way. Which I think tells you a lot about the value of these two perspectives next to each other. So what happens then If you have legions of psychology researchers conducting what is biological research, that is, they are studying biology, in this case the brain of living things, without any guiding principles from evolutionary theory that explains features of biology. That is what happens when you have biology researchers conducting research without any mind paid to the force that shaped this biological thing they're studying. And the answer here in practice is that people do a lot of guesswork. They work off hunches that seem plausible. They label behaviors and think they've explained them. They don't end up tying their research into some larger cohesive whole. They chase dead ends. They catalog facts without explaining them. They propose explanations for things that couldn't even plausibly be true, like people believe lies because lies make them feel good. Importantly, for the purpose of what we're going to be examining today, these researchers also go on what we would call fishing expeditions. That is, once people aren't guiding their research towards specific questions of function and specific questions of form, they are testing pretty much anything. And when you're testing anything, it's easier to justify collecting a ton of data, breaking that data down into a plethora of different comparisons, and looking for any statistical relationships that you can find. And then you just report the findings that work out, and you fail to report the findings that didn't work. It's called a fishing expedition, effectively, because you cast as wide a net as possible to catch whatever fish you can, and in the process, you also happen to catch whatever bits of trash or anything else happen to be floating in the water and get caught up in your net. And as it turns out, when you do that, you end up with very bad research. You find and publish a lot of false positives. That is, you find results that don't accurately describe reality, but arise simply due to chance or luck factors. In other words, you're on a fishing expedition and you're fishing up a lot of trash. And there's an easy way to think about this issue, which is that if you flip a totally normal coin, you'd expect the coin to come up heads half the time and tails half the time. But this expectation about what happens would be one of what happens over an infinite number of flips. Sometimes a totally normal coin is going to be flipped 10 times and it's going to come up heads 10 times in a row. That happens about once per 1,000 times you flip a coin 10 times in a row, but it does happen. 1 in 1,000. It's very unlikely, right? Well, now imagine you have a room full of people flipping totally normal coins. There are 50 people in a room flipping coins over and over and over again. The odds that at least some of those people are going to observe unusual patterns of heads or tails goes up by a lot. And those odds can increase further if people are allowed to flip a coin 20 times, but report the results by counting the flips however they want. That is, if you reported the results of 20 coin flips in a row, you have a certain probability that you see something unusual. But what happens if you report the first 10 flips and then you report the second 10 flips separately? Now you have 2 chances to see if something unusual popped up. But what if you still haven't found an unusual result? Well, now you can maybe report those 20 coin flips in batches of 5. The first 5 coin flips went like this. The second 5 coin flips went like this. The third and the fourth. Now you've effectively quadrupled your chances of finding something statistically unusual. It's unusual to see heads come up 5 times in a row, but if you can start counting whenever you want, you're going to see heads come up a lot more often than you might expect. And now what if, for some totally weird reason, you're actually rewarded for finding unusual patterns of heads and tails when you're flipping the coins? Let's say each time you observe some statistically unusual result, you got $5. And you can report your flips however you want. And you have a room full of people flipping coins. And there's no agreed upon method of how you should report your coin flips or why you should report your coin flips. So what you're going to end up with in this situation is a lot of unusual reports from totally normal coins. People will think they're learning about real effects where none exist. This is what we call false positives, results that look real but aren't. Something similar happens when it comes to academic research, especially with respect to psychology. And it's been shown how easy it can be to make findings out of nothing. Specifically, there was this paper here, published in 2011, entitled False Positive Psychology. Undisclosed flexibility in data collection and analysis allows presenting anything as significant. Authored by Simmons, Nelson, and Simonson. In this paper, the authors examined what they call researcher degrees of freedom that allow researchers to massively increase their chances of finding false positives. What we mean by a researcher degree of freedom here is like our coin flip example. When someone is conducting research and analyzing data, they have to make a lot of choices about how they're doing their research and how they're analyzing their data, and not all of these decisions are made beforehand. In essence, researchers have a lot of freedom to decide how they collect and how they report their data. And in this paper, one such example the authors raise here is how researchers might think about outliers. Outliers in your data. An outlier is just a response that's very different than your usual response. To think of an example here, suppose you're giving people an online survey and you're able to track how long they take to answer a question. The average time across all your participants is 5 seconds per question they answer. So if you see a participant who takes 1 second on average per question to answer, maybe that suggests they're not really reading the question and they're just selecting answers at random. And if that's the case, you probably want to exclude their data because their data is not useful or informative. But you don't really know who was reading it and who wasn't, do you? All you have are your response times. Is 1 second too fast? What about 2 seconds? What about people who take 10 minutes per question? Does that suggest maybe those people are distracted and not really paying attention to your survey either? Maybe we should exclude them too. These are judgment calls that can go in either direction with some justifiable reasoning. And that gives researchers the freedom to decide whether or not to exclude certain outliers or why they might retain those outliers. You have to make a decision. And the authors of the paper note there's a great deal of ambiguity here. When they were looking at papers, some researchers excluded outliers, while others didn't exclude anything. The criteria for excluding outliers showed a remarkable lack of consistency between the authors, because there was no agreed upon method for determining where the cutoff should be, who is an outlier and who should be removed. The researchers had the freedom to look at their data and slice it up however they want. Now, if these researchers were making judgment calls in some inconsistent but impartial way, that might not cause any problems. But there are incentive structures in place in the academic field. If you want to publish your research, academic journals don't tend to publish research findings that don't have results in them. You need a positive result to publish a lot of times. Now, part of the reason you might not have found results is maybe you had a bad hypothesis, maybe you had a bad experimental design, and a number of other factors. And maybe you don't want to publish those studies because they're just not very good. But the larger point here is unless you have some statistically significant findings to report, the chances your work gets published goes down. You need the findings to have a better chance of publishing. And if you aren't getting published as a researcher, your status within the academic community will fall relative to those who are getting published, which means you might get passed over for jobs, promotions, grants, and all the other financial and social incentives that come with being known as a great researcher. That is something interesting to say. So, if people have the freedom to make choices about what data to include or exclude, no set standards for how this is done in advance, and a self-serving set of incentives that push them to find statistically significant results, might that bias the researchers to make some self-serving decisions about how to treat outliers, or even what an outlier is, and what other decisions might they make that are like this? To demonstrate what some of these decisions look like and how they can impact the reporting of results, Simmons and colleagues simulated thousands of sets of hypothetical research data. And this hypothetical data was generated such that all the samples were supposed to come from the same population. In other words, the randomly generated data should have been generated from the same parameters. It should have the same average value. It should have the same standard deviations, and so on. Again, you can think of this as having thousands of completely normal fair coins. They should all come up heads and tails in exactly the same proportions if you were to flip them an infinite number of times. But in this case, you're only flipping them 10 times in a row. You have 1,000 normal coins that you are flipping 10 times in a row. In the example that the authors give in their paper, they imagine a researcher who collects data on a consumer study, say. And this study is measuring people's willingness to pay for a product, and it's measuring their enjoyment of that product. And you want to test to see whether some experimental manipulation affects either people's willingness to pay for a product, their enjoyment of the product, or some combination of those two factors together. You could perhaps bundle those two factors and say, this is how people feel about your product. Some mathematical equivalent of their enjoyment and their willingness to pay. If your experimental design has absolutely no effect in reality, that is, it doesn't actually change people's willingness to pay for a product or enjoy it, you will still sometimes find statistical results just by chance. However, because you have multiple questions you're looking at here, you now have multiple chances to find an effect just by chance because you've decided to look at the data in different ways. According to their simulations here, if you looked at two possible outcome variables, how much you enjoy a product, how much you're willing to pay for a product, or some combination of those two factors, you roughly double your chances of finding a false positive. That is, if you only have a single dependent variable, you would find a false positive 5% of the time. Standard statistical testing in psychology. But if you're looking at multiple dependent factors, in this case, two of them or some combination of those two, you now had a 9.5% chance to find a false positive result. You about doubled it. Next, they tested to see what happens if researchers were to peek at their data and then decide whether to keep collecting participants. That is, imagine you have an experiment with two groups, Group A and Group B. Group A is going to see one thing, Group B is going to see another thing, and then you test to see if seeing that thing created some difference between the groups. Does seeing this commercial increase your desire to buy a product? Something like that. So let's say you have 20 people in Group A and 20 people in Group B, and you collect your data, and then you test to see if there's a difference. If there is, great. Stop your research and publish your results because you found something. But what if there wasn't a difference between Group A and B? For reasons I'm not going to go into here, the size of your sample is related to the significance of your finding. The more people you have, the greater your chances of finding something significant. So perhaps the reason you didn't find anything significant is simply because your sample size was too small. So what you do is, if you tested 20 people in each group and you didn't find a result, well, maybe now collect 10 more people for each group and test again. See if the difference is significant now. However, now because you've tested twice, you have increased your chances you might find something just randomly. And they found that this particular researcher degree of freedom increased the chances by about 50% to find a false positive. Again, usual 5% chance to find a false positive. If you collect 20 people, test, and if you don't find a result, collect 10 more and test again. This increased the odds you would find something to 7.7%. And for what it's worth, that approximately 8% estimate is assuming you don't try to collect more people a second time, and then that fails, and then you try and collect 10 more people a third time and test again. Basically, just keep repeating this process until you either stop collecting data or find something significant. So if you didn't find a result in the first 20, try 10 more. If you still didn't find a result, try 10 more after that. If you didn't find a result, keep trying. And for what it's worth, The authors of this paper cite some research suggesting about 70% or so of behavioral scientists, that is, psychology researchers, admit to doing something like this in practice. But they didn't think it had a big impact on their research findings, which is a bit of an oops. And something similar also happens, say, if you want to account for gender. That is, if you break your sample down and look at okay, was there an overall difference? And then break your sample down, was there a difference for men? And was there a difference for women? Or what if you break it down by condition? Was there a difference between group A and B? Well, was there also a difference between men and women? Well, was there also a difference between men and women in group A and men and women in group B? And so on. Here you can boost up your false positive rate from 5% to 12%, more than doubling the chances you find something significant. And they also consider what might happen if you break your data down into, say, low, medium, and high groups. That is, does my experimental intervention have a different effect on people who really hate something, who are indifferent towards that thing, or who really like that thing? Now you can compare someone who hates a product to people who are indifferent to it and to people who like it. And then you can compare the people who are indifferent to the people who enjoy it. And then you can just report any of those comparisons that turn up positive. Simulating that, they found the false positive rate again jumped from about 5% to 12.6%. And all of what we just discussed is what happens when the researcher employs these methods separately. But what if you combined these researcher degrees of freedom? You might look at multiple dependent variables. How much do people like a product? How much are they willing to pay for a product? If you find an effect, publish it. But if you don't, maybe break your data down by men and women. Check again. Did you find a result? If so, publish it. But if you didn't, well, maybe try collecting more people. Did you find a result now? If so, publish it. But if you didn't find a result, well, what if the experimental manipulation is affecting people who like this a little bit, not at all, or a lot? Break that down again. Check it again. Just keep combining these researcher degrees of freedom. And when they simulated this, they found that if you combined these methods, you could produce a statistically significant result 61% of the time. That is, when you're looking at data generated from the exact same population, data you should not expect to have any differences in reality, you can increase the chance of finding something significant from 5% to 61%, just by employing a few different methods of researcher degrees of freedom in terms of how you collect or how you analyze your data. And when you take these researcher degrees of freedom and you combine them with the incentive structure in academia for publishing statistically significant results, what you have is a pile of false positives ready to be published. So just in case this all feels a little bit difficult to keep track of, again, we can simplify what's going on here by returning to coin flips. If you flip a totally normal coin 10 times in a row, there's a certain chance you're going to observe something unlikely. But the more times you flip that coin 10 times, the more chances you have to see something unlikely in any of those trials. You have a certain chance if you do it once, you have a higher chance if you do it twice, you have a higher chance if you do it 50 times. So you flip the coin 10 times. Did you see something unusual? If you did, publish it. If you didn't, flip it 10 times again. Did you see something unusual now? If you did, publish it. If you didn't, try again. Compare your first 10 flips to your second 10 flips. Or your first and your second 10 flips to the third 10 flips. Or compare coins flipped by men and coins flipped by women. Compare coins flipped by men and women of different ages. The more you flip that coin 10 times in a row, and the more different analyses you try to do, the more often you're going to see something unusual at some point. In fact, if you keep doing that, if you keep sitting there and flipping a coin 10 times, and then flipping it 10 times again and 10 times again and so on, if you keep doing that, eventually, the chances you see something unusual at some point begins to become more likely than the chances you never see anything unusual. That is, if you flip a coin 10 times in a row, and you do that 10,000 times, it would be remarkable if your coin never came up heads 10 times in a row once, or it never came up tails 10 times in a row once. At some point, observing something, anything unusual, becomes extremely likely. So just keep making comparisons and just keep flipping coins until you get the results you can publish. And this is the important part, you generally keep quiet about all the times you failed to find any results. People will see 3 published attempts that work out and never read about the 97 attempts that failed. And this issue here, the failure to report things that don't work out, actually has a name. For the curious among you, it's called the file drawer problem. And it's called that because attempts that don't work out, rather than being published, just get tucked away in a file cabinet somewhere and forgotten about, and no one knows that they exist. And what I'm saying here isn't just some abstract idea about simulating data. It has real-life consequences for the validity of what gets published, and we can see that by examining exactly how well psychology research tends to replicate. Replication in science is just what it sounds like. A researcher tries to do something another researcher did before and see if they observe the same results. If you have a real result on your hand, if A causes B, it should be expected to replicate. If your finding doesn't replicate, that might suggest that what you observed the first time was just some statistical fluke. However, replication attempts in practice tend to be rare for several reasons. Again, mostly related to the incentive structure in academia. Being known as the person who discovered an effect carries more prestige than being the other person who just replicated an effect and said it worked out. Further, since the effect has already been published the first time, if you replicate it, why are we going to publish this again? The journal will tell you, we already know this is true, so why do we need to publish your finding? We're just restating our original article. What's the point? In other words, if we know men are taller than women on average, we don't need endless demonstrations that, yes, this is again the case. But even if your replication attempt fails, well, so what? Maybe you did the experiment wrong. Maybe you got unlucky. Maybe the journal just wants to publish something new and exciting and attention-grabbing and not retread old ground. They don't want to start conflicts between, we published this article before and now here's an article countering that article. That's not necessarily what the journals are interested in doing. It's substantially harder to publish papers that just replicate old work, so people rarely try. And even when they try, the replication attempt is likely to just end up in a file drawer somewhere instead of in a journal. If people are rarely trying to replicate research, however, it becomes harder and harder to know which of these published effects are real and which of them were just statistical flukes, perhaps created by researchers who did 100 tests and report the 3 that worked. This is where the reproducibility project and the associated article entitled Estimating the Reproducibility of Psychological Science comes in. This paper was the result of a large team of researchers working together, and they were attempting to replicate the results of 100 published psychological studies, both experimental and correlational studies, that were published in 3 of the top psychology journals at the time. So they pulled 100 articles from these 3 top psychology journals and attempted to replicate them. The replication attempts were designed to use the original materials as often as possible, and they tried to utilize high-powered designs, which is just a technical term for, if the effect really exists, we should be likely to find it. Of the 100 original studies, 97 of them reported statistically significant findings. And the other 3 didn't report statistically significant findings, but suggested the findings were actually there. It was borderline, and they interpreted this as positive evidence. The same number of statistically significant findings in the 100 replication attempts was 36, down from 97 or 100 to 36. We could also consider the size of the finding. That is, did the original study report a finding that was large or small? You don't need to understand what the specific number of an effect size means to know this. A large effect is something with a lot of practical significance, while a small effect is something of little practical significance. That is, if you're trying to predict something, how much is this person likely to do that? A large effect has a good predictive value. A small effect has a small predictive value. As it turns out, the average effect size of the original studies was about twice as large as the replication attempts. And in 82% of the time, the original study had a larger effect size than the replication. In other words, tying these together, not only were replication attempts far less likely to turn up any results in the first place, but if they did turn up results, they tended to appear far smaller and less practically useful than originally reported the majority of the time. And further, while there aren't real standards for what counts as a successful or unsuccessful replication, that is, does the study support the one that came before it, they asked the researchers that were replicating this to subjectively rate, did your replication attempt actually replicate the work you were trying to? And here, again, a little bit under 40% of the replicators said yes, I think my study replicated the original effect, which corresponds pretty nicely to the statistical data. It's also worth noting that simple effects replicated better than interaction effects. And what this means, if you have two groups, A and B, if you find a difference between A and B, that's more likely to show up again than if you have men and women in group A versus men and women in group B in interaction. The interactions are less likely to show up again. The more complex an effect was, the less likely it was to replicate. While replication attempts are not always perfect, and the replication attempts themselves may not replicate, that is, sometimes you get a false negative, a finding is real and you just fail to find it by chance. If you take this replication project together with this idea of researcher degrees of freedom, I get the following sense from this pattern of results. Most journals aren't interested in publishing research that doesn't turn up anything new or interesting. Academic journals are incentivized to publish research in a certain way, and academics that are publishing this research are incentivized to publish it to further their careers. This means both the researchers are more likely to conduct research or analysis in ways that turn up false positives, and that the journals are more likely to publish false positive results. And you should expect this to happen more often than chance by a lot. So not only are people reporting effects that don't exist, they're often overstating the ones that actually do, because this helps you get published. As interaction effects, such as an intervention working in men but not women, are less likely to replicate, the complex effects are less likely to replicate, this implies that maybe these interactions are more likely to represent creative analysis and interpretation by the researchers rather than something they set out to find in the first place. But there's another factor at work here as well. It's possible that journals want to publish surprising or counterintuitive findings. Clickbait, in other words. After all, if you read a research paper that says the sky is blue or something similar, and you see this response online all the time, people will say, who cares? I already know that. Why did we need to do research to figure this out? It's obvious. But when a research finding comes along that challenges common wisdom, that tends to gather attention and is more likely to be discussed and cited by other people. And this citation part turns out to be important, because in academia, part of the prestige of a journal is determined by what is known as its impact factor, which is how often are the articles in your journal cited by other authors. If a journal publishes a paper that a lot of people cite as a source, impact factor goes up and it grows in prestige. If no one references the articles published in your journal, your impact factor falls and your journal's prestige falls. So if people are more likely to cite novel or surprising or counterintuitive findings, then journals are naturally incentivized to publish that type of research. But why might a finding seem surprising or counterintuitive? Well, one answer is that it's surprising because a lot of people think something that's wrong. But another, often more plausible answer is that it's surprising because the finding is wrong. It's surprising precisely because this is an inaccurate description of reality. Ironically, that might make the journal more likely to publish it if they just find a statistical fluke. And all of a sudden, you have a new finding rolling around that a lot of people are citing. We'll see an example of that soon. Now, this problem is not unique to psychology by any means. There's another paper we might consider. This is by authors Kaplan and Irvin in 2015, entitled Likelihood of Null Effects of Large NHLBI Clinical Trials Has Increased Over Time. Don't have to remember that, but what the title means is quite simple, which is that over time, certain studies have become more likely to say, our research didn't find anything. They're more likely to report, we did not see an effect. In this paper, the authors were examining some research from 1970 to 2012. And it was looking at the effectiveness of various drugs and dietary supplements for preventing or treating cardiovascular disease. So does this medication, does this supplement help cardiovascular disease? They had 55 studies that met their inclusion criteria from 1970 to 2012. And what's fascinating about this data set is what happened in the year 2000. It's a very important milestone for research in this field with respect to what is called pre-registration. And pre-registration is exactly what it sounds like. It represents a case where the researcher is going to say what they intend to do and what they intend to look at in advance of conducting their research. Before they have the data, they will say what they are looking to do and what they are looking to compare. Now, this is important because pre-registration reduces the ability of researchers to cheat, or more politely, to employ some self-serving researcher degrees of freedom. Because if you can decide what analysis you're doing after you have the data, then you can think about how you might want to cut it up. If you have to say beforehand, you're making more of a definite stance of this is what I'm really looking at. Prior to the year 2000, none of these studies had to pre-register. After the year 2000, all of the studies had to pre-register. It's a very important milestone. In what's an otherwise outstanding coincidence, prior to the year 2000, 57% of the papers were reporting statistically significant effects. After the year 2000, 8% of the studies did, at least with respect to what they pre-registered. That is, after the year 2000, pre-registered studies did report a significant effect about half the time, but, and this is the crucial part, with respect to variables they didn't pre-register. With respect to what they actually said they were looking at, they found something 8% of the time. With respect to anything they looked for after the fact, over 50% of the time. In other words, when people didn't have to say what tests they intended to do before they conducted their research, they could find results over half the time. When they did have to say what they were looking for, results turned up less than 10% of the time. This very heavily suggests the presence of researcher degrees of freedom that we were discussing before. And it actually mimics the number of false positives from the simulations rather closely, as well as resembling some of the outcomes of the replication project. So returning to the psychology replication issue, here's a very interesting question worth thinking about. Why are psychologists so bad at generating hypotheses? I know that question might sound mean on the surface, and maybe it is a little bit of a mean question, but I want to run you through my thinking here. Of the replication attempts, less than half of those findings replicated. And when they did replicate, they tended to be far smaller, far less important than originally stated. So let's just assume the replication numbers are likely to replicate themselves. The replications are an accurate determination of how often psychology research should be expected to replicate. About 33-40% of the time. We're just going to assume that's accurate to make things easy on the math. It's also important to bear in mind that these are studies that they attempted to replicate that got published in what are considered 3 of the top journals in the field. But what about the studies that never got published? Or the ones that got published in less prestigious journals? Presumably, the studies that don't get published often tend to not get published because they failed to find anything. The researcher just had a bad hypothesis or bad methods or something. But it's important we count these failed studies as psychology research that's been conducted. Similarly, we might think that studies published in less prestigious journals are also more likely to publish bad research, because these less prestigious journals just have less studies to work with, and so they publish whatever they get. Take what you can get in the academic world. Well, it's hard to say precisely how many studies are conducted in psychology per study that gets published. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that half of the psychology research that is conducted eventually gets published to make the math easy. I suspect the number that hit the file drawer are larger than 50%, but we're just going to say half, again, to make the number easy. So think about it just in terms of sheer numbers. This would mean that out of every 100 psychology studies that get conducted, only about half get published. So 50 of this 100 get published. And of that 50, only about a third are going to replicate, which is about 15 of the original 100. In other words, somewhere around 85% of psychology research would be pointless, either because they didn't find anything real or they're chasing a dead end, assuming our replication numbers are reliable. And of that 15 that actually replicate, they are likely overstating the importance of their work the majority of the time. And that's just considering the effects that are going to replicate reliably. There's also the matter of people misinterpreting or misunderstanding real and reliable effects, like we saw earlier. It's possible an effect may replicate, like, say, the difference in outcomes between people with growth mindsets and fixed mindsets. Maybe that effect replicates, but the explanation or understanding of that effect is hopelessly muddled or wrong. Also, perhaps like our understanding of growth and fixed mindsets. So in other words, even if 15 out of the 100 psychology papers turn up real effects, that doesn't mean those 15 effects have been successfully explained or understood, and they haven't been placed in the correct theoretical framework. This leaves psychology research making far more noise than progress. And so why is so much of this research bad? To tie all this back to evolutionary theory, I again want to highlight why guiding theories are likely very important here. While I can't say that evolutionary-minded research is just going to produce better results across the board, I think the theory behind it could well end up improving psychology research. Evolutionary theory should be expected to make people better at generating, testing, interpreting, and explaining their results. That is, has the potential to help people conduct better research. And it can also aid people in spotting bad, incomplete, or in some way faulty research with greater ease. For example, if you're predicting an effect, a specific effect, for specific reasons, you should not be going on fishing expeditions very often. You should be looking for a very specific relationship between A and B for this reason in these contexts. And if you were to go on a fishing expedition, just gather a bunch of data and look at whatever you can find, it then becomes harder to justify your results. Again, think about kin selection theory. Kin selection theory predicts genetically related individuals should be inclined towards greater altruism towards each other, because the genetic success of your kin is to some extent your own genetic reproductive success too. Kin selection theory makes some very specific predictions that can be tested in this regard. But what if it was the case that you conducted some research utilizing kin selection theory and you found a significant result for men, but not women? This would seem rather strange and require an explanation. After all, aren't men and women equally related to their kin? Why is there a difference here? This is something you really have to explain. However, if you're not working off evolutionary theory, you don't actually have to explain anything. Not really. You can make some vague reference to this idea that our culture teaches men to be nicer people because they're given the role of provider, or maleness is valued in families, or men just feel better to be altruistic, or something similar, and leave it at that. Such pseudo-explanations provided as a matter of routine in the psychology literature, they're not going to be spotted if you don't have the theory to spot them, and false positives become easier to slip past people's notice. So I want to finish up today with a quick story. Well, I suppose two quick stories. But a quick story from my own publishing past on this front to demonstrate the value of evolutionary theory in research and the problems that can arise with replication, publication, social status, and the whole surrounding context of the scientific literature. In my reading about morality and punishment, what I was doing my dissertation on, I came across this paper that was entitled, "Human Punishment is Motivated by Inequality Aversion, Not a Desire for Reciprocity." The premise of the paper was the following. Sometimes you find people are willing to punish others who cheat them. That is, if someone wants to steal from you, you'd likely experience an urge to get back at them and punish them for stealing. The authors were contending that this punishment was not driven by the fact that someone took something from you, that you experienced a loss, and that was what was encouraging your punishment, but rather that you were punishing them because you experienced a lower relative payoff to them from the behavior. Now, the researchers conducted an experimental taking game to try and demonstrate this, and the taking game had the following premise. You have player A and player B. Say, you are player A, I am player B. We enter this study, and we are randomly assigned different payments. Player A, that's you always start with 70 cents. And player B, that's me, I will either start with 10 cents, with 30 cents, or 70 cents, just like you. I have the option to cheat, as the authors put it, and take 20 cents from you and add it to my payment. And after I choose to do that or not, you have the option to give up some of your money to punish me. By which you mean you would give up, say, 5 cents, and I would lose money. More than 5 cents usually. I'd lose like 20 cents because you paid out. So it goes like this. This is the idea. In one condition, you have 70 cents. Start with, I have 10. If I take 20 from you, you have 50, and I have 30. Your payoff is still higher than mine. If you start with 70 and I start with 30, if I take 20 from you, we both end up with 50. Our payments are now the same. And if we both start off with 70 and I take 20 from you, you now end up worse off than I am. And what the authors found in this paper is that if I took money from you, you were only likely to pay to punish me in appreciable amounts when I ended up better off. In other words, people were punishing primarily when disadvantageous inequality was created, not when they just experienced losses, because everybody experienced losses, but only sometimes I ended up better off. And so the authors concluded that the punishment was being driven by this inequality itself. People weren't trying to punish those who inflict costs per se. The punishment was instead driven by some desire to promote fair behavior, or rather fair payoffs, rather than to deter people from hurting you. In a term, we would say people are inequality averse. They find inequality itself unpleasant and seek to punish it. I realized this finding and the associated explanation sounded very strange. The authors were effectively claiming that reciprocal altruism was a bad explanation for human punishment, which cuts against a lot of what we know from the literature on both humans and non-humans. After all, we have covered in these lectures several examples of punishment and cheating in fish. Are fish not inequality averse? Are humans somehow different? And if we are, why? These are questions that started rattling around my mind. It also suggested that people should punish inequality when they're worse off than others, regardless of how that inequality came to be. After all, if people aren't punishing losses, but are punishing inequality itself. They should be interested in punishing others who came to be better off in pretty much any way at all. That is, if you work hard and you end up better off than me, I should want to punish you because you created inequality. And this is a theoretical problem for two reasons. First, it suggests people are going to try to punish those who are better off than they are, and that's hard to accomplish, because people who are better off than you might be that way because they're physically stronger, or they have better social networks, or stronger family ties, and generally command more resources and social power. Trying to punish people who are better off than you should prove especially costly, and doubly so because the punishment doesn't seem justified by their actions. A mechanism, a psychological mechanism that seeks to inflict costs on others also tends to inflict costs on the bearer, because other people don't like being punished and they'll defend against it. So these costs that you suffer trying to punish other people need to be offset elsewhere for the mechanism to prove adaptive. But what would be the possible benefits of just punishing inequality itself and not punishing because someone hurt you? This part is harder to say. It's clear how punishing someone who inflicts costs on you can prove adaptive, because you stop people from inflicting costs on you in the future. But why are you going to punish someone just because they're better off? What do you gain from this? And further, I saw that their experiment contained some important methodological confounds. The first is, in this original paper, the only way to generate inequality was through losses. As such, because all participants were experiencing losses, it's harder to say that was completely unimpactful in their punishment decision, because losses were present. And then, of course, there's also the matter of random distributions of money in some experimental context. That might not create a strong sense for who is entitled to what. Why do you have 70 cents and I have 10 because the coin flip came up a certain way? That's not fair. I'm allowed to take from you. We're just going to ignore that confound for now. It's just worth noting. So anyway, because all this research sounded so incomplete to me, I decided to replicate their experimental idea, but I added some things in as well. As before, I had a taking game where one participant would take money from another and end up either still worse off, the same, or better off than the person they took from. And then the person who was taken from could punish them if they wanted. And I replicated the original pattern of results, which you can see in this chart on the far left. That's the taking game. We see punishment was much higher when people ended up worse off than the person who took from them. However, I had two additional conditions. In one of these, player A and B got their starting payment, and player B could just add money to their own payment without touching player A's payment. So I could add 20 cents to my payment without affecting yours at all. Now, what I found here is that no matter whether inequality was created or not, player A, when they didn't experience losses, they really didn't punish people, regardless of inequality. That's on the far right. That's the augment condition. Here, inequality didn't seem to matter. And the third condition in the middle was a destruction condition. In this, again, player A, that's you, player B, we get our starting payments, and then for no reason at all, for no benefit for me, I could just destroy some of your payment. I could just say minus 20 cents to you. I get nothing, but you lose 20 cents. And then you can punish me if you want. Again, my destroying your income would either leave you still better off than me, it would leave you as good off as me, or it would leave me better off than you. However, when I was just blowing up some of your money, regardless of any inequality, player B tended to punish, irrespective of it. So, to recap here, if you experienced losses through pure destruction, I just burned some of your money, you would punish regardless of whether that resulted in inequality or not. If you did not experience losses, I just add money to my own payment and I leave yours alone, you would almost never punish that behavior. By contrast, if someone took from your payment and added to theirs, you might be more likely to punish them if they ended up better off than you, but you were still far more likely to punish them than if they didn't touch your payment at all. So here I have replicated the author's original effect, that's on the left, but I've added the two pieces of context on the right, showing that their interpretation of these numbers is not exactly accurate. They have an incorrect explanation for what they're seeing. People are definitely punishing losses, and they are only especially punishing inequality in very certain contexts. So having successfully done my science, I was excited to go and publish my paper. When I first discussed my work with an informal mentor of mine at the time, this person raised the question of why I was bothering to do this research in the first place. After all, this is just one paper in some journal published somewhere, and it's not some widely cited finding, so who really cares? Is it really worth pursuing this in the first place? Stubborn as I'm about things, I pressed on because I thought this was very neat. I thought it was interesting. My first attempt to publish this was in the original journal that the article I was replicating was published in. After all, that journal clearly seemed to care enough about this issue to publish it in the first place, so I figured they would be interested in publishing more on that exact same topic. And to their credit, they did send my paper out for peer review. This is where 3 other authors are going to look at your paper and determine if the journal should publish it. Unfortunately, one of their reviewers that they sent it out to happened to be an author on the paper that I was criticizing. So here is someone that's built part of their social reputation on the finding that I am now saying isn't quite right. And they have power over whether my paper is going to get published. They have to assess the quality of my work. And that's a pretty subjective thing. So here comes the opportunity to build in some researcher degrees of freedom. Or I suppose in this case, reviewer degrees of freedom. The author's original response was that my paper should not be published because it was too similar to their work. So here we see a case of replication being declined from publication in real time. Why bother publishing this? We already know this. When I explained in my response why the papers differ and why mine is recontextualizing the original finding, and how it showed the original author's interpretation was incomplete or wrong, now this reviewer came back with a new suggestion concerning my paper. It still shouldn't be published, but now because my paper is completely incomparable to theirs. It's too different. So in the span of a single reply, my paper went from being perceived as not novel enough to publish to being completely incomparable and thus not able to be published. When I pointed this out to the journal editor and suggested there might be a conflict of interests here in assigning this particular reviewer, as my findings are challenging their interpretation and, by extension, challenging their social prestige in some capacity, leading to some possibly biased assessment of my work, the journal ended up rejecting my paper for publication, and that's unlucky, I suppose. While I did go on to publish my work in a different journal, we can see all the stages of the process happening here in real time. You have researchers that are suggesting you should chase hot topics to build your own prestige up. You have replication attempts being downplayed as unimportant and not worthy of publication. And you have researchers that have some incentivized skin in the game concerning about what other people believe about their findings. And this leads them to interpret evidence in a possibly biased fashion that supports their own personal research. Indeed, that last point is particularly funny when you see this example of it. That is, some psychology researchers once published a finding that said holding a pen between your teeth makes people rate jokes as funnier as compared with holding it between your lips. And I'll show you that with this brush here. Holding it between your teeth looks like this. Holding it with your lips looks like this. They're saying when you hold it with your teeth, people perceive jokes to be funnier. Why? Well, they thought when you did something, hold it with your teeth, that physically mimics a smile, the fact that you are smiling would feed back on your ratings of humor. Because smiling is something people do when they find a joke funny. So effectively, the idea here is some part of your brain thinks, oh, I'm smiling. That must mean this joke is funny. And they would perceive the joke as funnier because of that. This finding apparently is taught in a lot of introductory psychology textbooks, and the authors note that it had been cited about 1,400 times by 2016. Then, 17 pre-registered independent replication attempts that made meticulous efforts to recreate the original study tried to find the effect again. They even consulted the authors of the original study. They tried to use the original paper material as much as they could. And these 17 pre-registered replication attempts were reported in a paper entitled Registration Replication Report, Strack, Martin, and Strepper, 1988. The Teeth report, that was published in 1988. They're trying to replicate this. These replication attempts, 17 of them, failed to find support for this. And if you want to take a look at this pattern of results report in the journal here, on the top part, you see the original published finding, and then below it, you see the 17 replication attempts. On the bottom, those 17 replication attempts are averaged out. So to put this research in context, the study asked, how funny is this cartoon? Give it a rating from 0 to 9. The original study said, if you have that pen between your teeth, you think that the cartoon is funnier by about 0.82 points on that 10-point scale. So let's round up and say, holding that pen between your teeth made the joke about 10% funnier. Collectively, the replication attempts reported a difference of 0.03 points. In other words, no difference. So naturally, the original authors, when faced with these 17 replication attempts and their general failure to replicate across them, just acknowledged that they were wrong and moved on. Except that's not what happened. Instead, two of the original authors, in this case Strack and Fritz, wrote a follow-up article trying to suggest that the 17 replication attempts were all wrong and couldn't be generalized to their original finding. I believe they cited some of these studies or all these studies had a camera present in the room and the camera will magically make the effect go away. And psychology research students that are recruited for these papers might know about our results and that'll make the effect go away. In other words, there's a reason for the saying that science progresses one funeral at a time. While science is a great tool for determining truth, it's just like any other tool. It's only as good as our ability to utilize it efficiently and correctly. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about evolutionary theory is that I think it's remarkably useful for guiding our use of this scientific tool. It helps us figure out the appropriate questions to ask and contextualize these results and understand and explain them. And while it's unlikely possible that you can separate out these human desires for status and prestige and material rewards from the use of science, hopefully evolutionary theory can help aim our search for true and useful information in the right direction more often and course correct when we go astray.